Chapter 5. The Church under Islam. The stable perseverance in these our days of the Greek Church, notwithstanding the oppression and contempt put upon it by the Turk and the allurements and pleasures of this world, is a confirmation no less convincing than the miracles and power which attended its first beginnings. For indeed it is admirable to see and consider with what constancy, resolution, and simplicity ignorant and poor men keep their faith. Sir Paul Reichwart, The Present State of the Greek and Armenian Churches, 1679. Imperium in imperio. It doth go hugely against the grain to see the crescent exalted everywhere, where the cross stood so long triumphant. So wrote Edward Browne in 1677. Soon after arriving as chaplain to the English embassy in Constantinople. To the Greeks in 1453, it must have also gone hugely against the grain. For more than 1,000 years, people had taken the Christian empire of Byzantium for granted as a permanent element in God's providential dispensation to the world. Now the God-protected city had fallen, and the Greeks were under the rule of the infidel. It was not an easy transition, but it was made less hard by the Turks themselves, who treated their Christian subjects with remarkable generosity. The Muslims in the 15th century were far more tolerant towards Christianity than Western Christians were towards one another during the Reformation and the 17th century. Islam regards the Bible as a holy book and Jesus Christ as a prophet. In Muslim eyes, therefore, the Christian religion is at some points erroneous, but not entirely false. And Christians, being people of the book, should not be treated as if on a level with mere pagans. According to Muslim teaching, Christians are to undergo no persecution, but may continue without interference in the observance of their faith, so long as they submit quietly to the power of Islam. Such were the principles which guided the conqueror of Constantinople, Sultan Muhammad II. Before the fall of the city, Greeks called him the precursor of Antichrist and the second Sennacherib. Sennacherib? But they found that in practice his rule was very different in character. Learning that the office of patriarch was vacant, Muhammad summoned the monk Gennadius, and installed him on the patriarchal throne. Gennadius, 1404-72, known as George Scholarius, before he became a monk, was a voluminous writer and the leading Greek theologian of his time. He was a determined opponent of the Church of Rome, and his appointment as patriarch meant the final abandonment of the Union of Florence. Doubtless for political reasons, the Sultan deliberately chose a man of anti-Latin convictions. With Gennadius as patriarch, there would be less likelihood of the Greeks seeking secret aid from Roman Catholic powers. The Sultan himself instituted the patriarch, ceremonially investing him with his pastoral staff, exactly as the autocrats of Byzantium had formerly done. The action was symbolic. Muhammad the Conqueror, champion of Islam, became also the protector of Orthodoxy, taking over the role once exercised by the Christian emperor. Thus, Christians were assured a definite place in the Turkish order of society, but, as they were soon to discover, it was a place of guaranteed inferiority. Christianity under Islam was a second-class religion, and its adherents second-class citizens. They paid heavy taxes, wore a distinctive dress, were not allowed to serve in the army, and were forbidden to marry Muslim women. The Church was allowed to undertake no missionary work, and it was a crime to convert a Muslim to the Christian faith. From the material point of view, there was every inducement for a Christian to apostatize to Islam. Direct persecution often serves to strengthen a church, but the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire were usually denied the more heroic ways of witnessing to their faith, and were subjected instead to the demoralizing effects of an unrelenting social pressure. Nor was this all. After the fall of Constantinople, the church was not allowed to revert to the situation before the conversion of Constantine. Paradoxically enough, the things of Caesar now became more closely associated with the things of God than they had ever been before. For the Muslims drew no distinction between religion and politics. From their point of view, if Christianity was to be recognized as an independent religious faith, it was necessary for Christians to be organized as an independent political unit, an empire within the empire. The Orthodox Church therefore became a civil as well as a religious institution. It was turned into the Rum Millet, the Roman nation. The ecclesiastical structure was taken over in toto as an instrument of secular administration. The bishops became government officials. The patriarch was not only the spiritual head of the Greek Orthodox Church, but the civil head of the Greek nation. The ethnarch of Militbashi. Oh, I get it. The ethnarch of Militbashi. This situation continued in Turkey until 1923, and in Cyprus until the death of Archbishop Macarius III, 1977. The Millet system performed one invaluable service. It made possible the survival of the Greek nation as a distinctive unit through 4 centuries of alien rule. But on the life of the Church it had 2 melancholy effects. It led first to a sad confusion between orthodoxy and nationalism. With their civil and political life organised completely around the Church, it became all but impossible for the Greeks to distinguish between church and nation. The Orthodox faith, being universal, is limited to no single people, culture or language, but to the Greek of the Turkish Empire Hellenism, and Orthodoxy became inextricably intertwined, far more so than they had ever been in the Byzantine Empire. The effects of this confusion continue to the present day. In the second place, the Church's higher administration became caught up in a degrading system of corruption and simony. Involved as they were in worldly affairs and matters political, the bishops fell a prey to ambition and financial greed. Each new patriarch required a beret. A beret? Oh yeah, a beret from the Sultan before he could assume office. And for this document, I've lost where I was. And for this document, he was obliged to pay heavily. The patriarch recovered his expenses from the episcopate by exacting a fee from each bishop before instituting him in his diocese. The bishops in turn taxed the parish clergy, and the clergy taxed their flocks. Good God. What was once said of the papacy was certainly true of the ecumenical patriarch under the Turks. Everything was for sale. When there were several candidates for the patriarchal throne, the Turks virtually sold it to the highest bidder, and they were quick to see that it was in their financial interests to change the patriarch as frequently as possible, so as to multiply occasions for selling the beret. Is it a beret or a beret? Let me have a look at that, hold on. Yeah, so it's a beret. Patriarchs were removed and reinstated with kaleidoscopic rapidity. Out of 159 patriarchs who have held office between the 15th and the 20th century, the Turks have on 105 occasions driven patriarchs from their throne. Wow! There have been 27 abdications, often involuntary. 6 patriarchs have suffered violent deaths by hanging, poisoning or drowning, and only 21 have died natural deaths while in office. The same man sometimes held office on 4 or 5 different occasions, and there were usually several ex-patriarchs watching restively in exile for a chance to return to the throne. The extreme insecurity of the patriarch naturally gave rise to continual intrigues among the metropolitans of the Holy Synod, who hoped to succeed him, and the leaders of the church were usually separated into bitterly hostile parties. Every good Christian, wrote an English resident in the 17th century Levant, ought with sadness to consider, and with compassion to behold this once glorious church to tear and rend out her own bowels, and give them for food to vultures and ravens, and to the wild and fierce creatures of the world. But if the Patriarchate of Constantinople suffered an inward decay, outwardly its power expanded as never before. The Turks looked on the Patriarch of Constantinople as the head of all Orthodox Christians in their dominions. The other patriarchates, also within the Ottoman Empire, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, remained theoretically independent, but were in practice subordinate. The churches of Bulgaria and Serbia, likewise within Turkish dominions, gradually lost all independence, and by the mid-18th century had passed directly under the ecumenical patriarch's control. But in the 19th century, as Turkish power declined, the frontiers of the Patriarchate contracted. The nations which gained freedom from the Turks found it impractical to remain subject ecclesiastically to a patriarch resident in the Turkish capital and closely involved in the Turkish political system. The patriarch resisted as long as he could, but in each case he bowed eventually to the inevitable. A series of national churches were carved out of the Patriarchate. The Church of Greece, organised in 1833, recognised by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1850. The Church of Romania, organised in 1864, recognised in 1885. The Church of Bulgaria, re-established in 1871, not recognised by Constantinople until 1945. The Church of Serbia, restored and recognised in 1879. Ugh. The diminution, that's a hard word. The diminution of the Patriarchate has continued in the 20th century, chiefly as a result of war, and its membership in the Balkans is now but a tiny fraction of what it once was in the palmy days of Ottoman suzerainty. Suzerainty. Hold on, I'm going to just quickly Google those two words because they're difficult words. Diminution means a reduction, decrease, or lessening in size, extent, importance, or value. And then suzerainty. No. Suzerainty. Yes. Suzerainty, a position of control by a sovereign or state over another state that is internally autonomous. Suzerainty, yeah. So I'll read that section again for you. The diminution of the Patriarchate has continued in the 20th century, chiefly as a result of war, and its membership in the Balkans is now but a tiny fraction of what it once was in the palmy days of Ottoman suzerainty. The Turkish occupation had two opposite effects upon the intellectual life of the Church. It was the cause, on the one hand, of an immense conservatism, and on the other, of a certain westernization. Orthodoxy under the Turks felt itself on the defensive. The great aim was survival, to keep things going in hope of better days to come. The Greeks clung with miraculous tenacity to the Christian civilization which they had taken over from Byzantium, but they had little opportunity to develop this civilization creatively. Understandably enough, they were usually content to repeat acceptable formulae to entrench themselves in the positions which they had inherited from the past. Greek thought underwent an ossification and a hardening which one cannot but regret. Yet conservatism had its advantages. In a dark and difficult period, the Greeks did in fact maintain the Orthodox tradition substantially unimpaired. The Orthodox under Islam took as their guide Paul's words to Timothy, "Guard the deposit. Keep safe what has been entrusted to you. 1 Timothy chapter 6:20. Could they in the end have chosen a better motto? Yet alongside this traditionalism, there is another and contrary current in Orthodox theology of the 17th and 18th centuries, the current of Western infiltration. It was difficult for the Orthodox under Ottoman rule to maintain a good standard of scholarship. Greeks who wished for a higher education were obliged to travel to non-Orthodox world, to Italy and Germany, to Paris, and even as far as Oxford. Among the distinguished Greek theologians of the Turkish period, a few were self-taught, but the overwhelming majority had been trained in the West under Roman Catholic or Protestant masters. Inevitably, this had an effect upon the way in which they interpreted Orthodox theology. Certainly Greek students in the West read the Fathers, but they only became acquainted with such of the Fathers as were held in esteem by their non-Orthodox professors. Thus Gregory Palamas was still read for his spiritual teaching by the monks of Athos, but to most learned Greek theologians of the Turkish period he was utterly unknown. In the works of Eustratius Argenti, died 1758 approximately, the ablest Greek theologian of his time, there is not a single citation from Palamas, and his case is typical. It is symbolic of the state of Greek Orthodox learning in the last 4 centuries that one of the chief works of Palamas, the Triads in Defence of the Holy Hesychasts, should have remained in great part unpublished until 1959. There was a real danger that Greeks who studied in the West, even though they remained fully loyal in intention to their own church, would lose their Orthodox mentality and become cut off from Orthodoxy as a living tradition. It was difficult for them not to look at theology through Western spectacles, whether consciously or not. They used terminology and forms of argument foreign to their own church. Orthodox theology underwent what the Russian theologian Father Georgius Florovsky, 1893 to 1979, has appropriately termed a pseudomorphosis. Religious thinkers of the Turkish period can be divided for the most part into 2 broad groups, the Latinizers and the Protestantizers. Yet the extent of this westernization must not be exaggerated. Greeks used the outward forms which they had learnt in the West, but in the substance of their thought the great majority remained fundamentally Orthodox. The tradition was at times distorted by being forced into alien moulds, distorted but not wholly destroyed. Keeping in mind this twofold background of conservatism and westernization, let us consider the challenge presented to the Orthodox world by Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Reformation and Counter-Reformation, their double impact. The forces of reform stopped short when they reached the borders of Russia and the Turkish Empire, so that the Orthodox Church has not undergone either a Reformation or a Counter-Reformation. Yet it would be a mistake to conclude that these 2 movements have had no influence whatever upon Orthodoxy. There were many means of contact. Orthodox, as we have seen, went to study in the West. Jesuits and Franciscans sent out to the Eastern Mediterranean undertook missionary work among Orthodox. The Jesuits were also at work in Ukraine. The foreign embassies at Constantinople, both of Roman and Catholic and of Protestant powers, played a religious as well as a political role. During the 17th century, these contacts led to significant developments in Orthodox theology. The first important exchange of views between Orthodox and Protestants began in 1573, when a group of Lutheran scholars in Tübingen, led by Jacob André and Martin Crucius, wrote to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Jeremiah II, sending him a copy of the Augsburg Confession translated into Greek. Doubtless they hoped to initiate some sort of reformation among the Greeks. As Crucius somewhat naively wrote, if they wished to take thought for the eternal salvation of their souls, They must join us and embrace our teaching, or else perish eternally. Jeremias, however, in his 3 answers to the Tübingen theologians, dated 1576, 1579, 1581, adhered strictly to the traditional Orthodox position and showed no inclination to Protestantism. To his first 2 letters, the Lutherans sent replies, but in his 3rd letter the Patriarch brought the correspondence to a close, feeling that matters had reached a deadlock. Go your own way and do not write any more on doctrinal matters, and if you do write, then write only for friendship's sake. The whole incident shows the interest felt by the reformers in the Orthodox Church. The Patriarch's answer are important as the first clear and authoritative critic of the doctrines of the Reformation from an Orthodox point of view. The chief matters discussed by Jeremias were free will and grace, Scripture and tradition, the sacraments, prayers for the dead, and the invocation of the saints. During the Tübingen interlude, Lutherans and Orthodox both showed great courtesy to one another. A very different spirit marked the first major contact between Orthodox and Counter-Reformation. This occurred outside the limits of the Turkish Empire, in Ukraine. After the destruction of Kievan power by the Tatars, a large area in the southwest of Russia, including the city of Kiev itself, became absorbed by Lithuania and Poland. This southwestern part of Russia is commonly known as Little Russia or Ukraine. The crowns of Poland and Lithuania were united under a single ruler from 1386. Thus, while the monarch of the joint realm, together with the majority of the population, was Roman Catholic, an appreciable minority of his subjects was Russian and Orthodox. These Orthodox in Ukraine were in an uncomfortable predicament. The Patriarch of Constantinople, to whose jurisdiction they belonged, could exercise no very effective control in Poland. Their bishops were appointed not by the Church but by the Roman Catholic King of Poland and were sometimes courtiers lacking in spiritual qualities. Towards the end of the 16th century, a Romeward movement developed among the Eastern Christians of Ukraine. In 1596, at the Council of Brest-Litovsk, 6 out of the 8 bishops present, including the Metropolitan of Kiev, Michael Rogoza, decided in favour of union with Rome, although the 2 remaining bishops, along with a significant number of the monastic and parish delegates, chose to remain Orthodox. So a sharp division occurred. On the one side, the continuing Orthodox, on the other, the Greek Catholics, Catholics of the Byzantine Rite, or Uniates, as they have been variously styled. The Greek Catholics accepted the principles proclaimed at the Council of Florence. They acknowledged the supremacy of the Pope, but were allowed to keep the traditional practices, such as married clergy, and they continued as before to use the Byzantine liturgy, although in course of time Western elements crept into it. Outwardly, therefore, there was very little to distinguish Catholics of the Byzantine Rite from Orthodox. How far, one wonders, did the uneducated peasantry appreciate what the dispute was really about? The continuing Orthodox in Polish Ukraine suffered severe repression from the Roman Catholic authorities, and there is no doubt that the Union of Brest has embittered relations between Orthodoxy and Rome from 1596 until the present day. Persecution, however, had in many ways an invigorating effect. The laity rallied to the defence of Orthodoxy, and in many places where the higher clergy had defected to Rome, the Orthodox tradition was upheld by powerful lay associations, known as the Brotherhoods, Bratstva. To answer Jesuit propaganda, they maintained printing presses and issued books in defence of Orthodoxy. To counteract the influence of the Jesuit schools, they organised Orthodox schools of their own. By 1650, the level of learning in Ukraine was higher than anywhere else in the Orthodox world. Scholars from Kiev, travelling to Moscow at the time, did much to raise intellectual standards in Great Russia. In this revival of learning, a particularly brilliant part was played by Peter of Mogila, Metropolitan of Kiev, from 1633 to 1647. To him we must shortly return. One of the representatives of the Patriarch of Constantinople at Brest in 1596 was a young Greek priest called Cyril Lucaris, 1572 to 1638. Whether as a result of his experience in Ukraine or because of friendships that he subsequently made in Constantinople, he showed in later life a strong hostility towards the Church of Rome. On becoming ecumenical patriarch, he devoted his full energies to combating Roman Catholic influence in the Turkish Empire. It was unfortunate, though perhaps inevitable, that in his struggle against the Papic Church, as the Greeks termed it, he should have become deeply involved in politics. He turned naturally for help to the Protestant embassies at Constantinople, while his Jesuit opponents, for their part, used the diplomatic representatives of the Roman Catholic powers, besides invoking the political assistance of Protestant diplomats. Cyril also fell under Protestant influence in matters of theology, and his Confession, first published at Geneva in 1629, is distinctively Calvinist in much of its teachings. Cyril's reign as patriarch is one long series of stormy intrigues and forms a lurid example of the troubled state of the ecumenical patriarchate under the Ottomans. 6 times deposed from office and 6 times reinstated, he was finally strangled by Turkish janissaries and his body cast into the Bosphorus. Kyrie eleison. In the last resort, there is something deeply tragic about his career, since he was possibly the most brilliant man to have held office as patriarch since the days of St. Photius. Had he but lived under happier conditions, freed from political intrigue, his exceptional gifts might have been put to better use. Cyril's Calvinism was sharply and speedily repudiated by his fellow Orthodox, his confession being condemned by no less than 6 local councils between 1638 and 1691. In direct reaction to Cyril, 2 other Orthodox hierarchs, Peter of Mogila and Dositheus of Jerusalem, produced confessions of their own. Peter's Orthodox confession, written in 1640, was based directly on Roman Catholic manuals. It was approved by the Council of Jasai in Romania, 1642, but only after it had been revised by a Greek, Meletius Syrigos, who in particular altered the passages about the consecration in the Eucharist, which Peter attributed solely in the words of institution, and about purgatory. Even in its revised form, the Confession of Mogila is still the most Latin document ever to be adopted by an official council of the Orthodox Church. Dositheus, Patriarch of Jerusalem from 1669 to 1707, likewise drew heavily upon Latin sources. His confession, ratified in 1672 by the Council of Jerusalem, also known as the Council of Bethlehem, answers Cyril's confession point by point with concision and clarity. The chief matters over which Cyril and Dositheus diverge are 4: the question of free will, grace, and predestination, the doctrine of the Church, the number and nature of the sacraments, and the veneration of icons. So that is 4: the question of free will, grace, and predestination, the doctrine of the Church, the number and nature of the sacraments, and the veneration of icons. In his statement upon the Eucharist, Dositheus adopted not only the Latin term transubstantiation, but the scholastic distinction between substance and accidents. And in defending prayers for the dead, he came very close to the Roman doctrine of purgatory, without actually using the word purgatory itself. On the whole, however, the confession of Dositheus is less Latin than that of Mogila, and must certainly be regarded as a document of primary importance in the history of 17th century Orthodox theology. Faced by the Calvinism of Lucaris, Dositheus used the weapons which lay nearest to hand. Latin weapons under the circumstances, it was perhaps the only thing that he could do. But the faith which he defended with these Latin weapons was not Roman, but Orthodox. Oh, okay. Outside Ukraine, relations between Orthodox and Roman Catholics were often friendly in the 17th century. In many places in the eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the Greek islands under Venetian rule, Greeks and Latins shared in one another's worship. We even read of Roman Catholic processions of the Blessed Sacrament, which the Orthodox clergy attended in force, wearing full vestments with candles and banners. Greek bishops invited the Latin missionaries to preach to their flocks or to hear confessions. But after 1700, these friendly contacts grew less frequent, and by 1750 they had largely ceased. In 1724, a large part of the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch submitted to Rome. After this, the Orthodox authorities, fearing that the same thing might happen elsewhere in the Turkish Empire, were far stricter in their dealings with Roman Catholics. The climax in anti-Roman feeling came in 1755, when the Patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria and Jerusalem declared Latin baptism to be entirely invalid and demanded that all converts to Orthodoxy be baptized anew. The baptisms of heretics are to be rejected and abhorred. The decree stated, "They are waters which cannot profit, nor give any sanctification to such as receive them, nor avail at all to the washing away of sins." This measure remained in force in the Greek world until the end of the 19th century, but it did not extend to the Church of Russia. The Russians generally baptized Roman Catholic converts between 1441 and 1667, but since 1667 they have not normally done so. The Orthodox of the 17th century came into contact not only with Roman Catholics, Lutherans and Calvinists, but also with the Church of England. Cyril Lucaris corresponded with Archbishop Abbot of Canterbury and a future Patriarch of Alexandria, Mitrophanus Critopoulos, studied at Oxford from 1617 to 1624. Critopoulos is the author of a confession slightly Protestant in tone but widely used in the Orthodox Church. Around 1694 there was even a plan to establish a Greek college at Gloucester Hall, Oxford, now Worcester Hall, Worcester College. Oh my God, I can't read. Right, let's read that again. Around 1694, please forgive me, there was even a plan to establish a Greek college at Gloucestershire Hall, Oxford, now Worcestershire Hall. And about 10 Greek students were actually sent to Oxford. But the plan failed for lack of money, and the Greeks found the food and lodging so poor that many of them ran away. From 1716 to 1725, a most interesting correspondence was maintained between the Orthodox and the non-jurors, a group of Anglicans who separated from the main body of the Church of England in 1688, rather than swear allegiance to the usurper William of Orange. The non-jurors approached both the four Eastern Patriarchates and the Church of Russia in the hope of establishing communion with the Orthodox. But the non-jurors could not accept the Orthodox teaching concerning the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They were also troubled by the veneration shown by Orthodoxy to the Mother of God, the saints and the holy icons. Eventually the correspondence was suspended without any agreement being reached. That's a shame. Looking back on the work of Mogila and Dositheus on the councils of Josiah and Jerusalem and on the correspondence with the non-jurors, one is struck by the limitations of Greek theology in this period. One does not find the Orthodox tradition in its fullness. Nevertheless, the councils of the 17th century made a permanent and constructive contribution to Orthodoxy. The Reformation controversies raised problems which neither the ecumenical councils nor the Church of the later Byzantine Empire was called to face. In the 17th century, the Orthodox were forced to think more carefully about the sacraments and about the nature and authority of the Church. It was important for the Orthodox to express its mind on these topics and to define its position in relation to the new teachings which had arisen in the West. This was the task which the 17th century councils achieved. These councils were local, but the substance of their decisions had been accepted by the Orthodox Church as a whole. The 17th century councils, like the Hesychast councils 300 years before, show that creative theological work did not come to an end in the Orthodox Church after the period of the ecumenical councils. There are important doctrines not defined by the general councils, which every Orthodox is bound to accept as an integral part of his faith. Throughout the Turkish period, the traditions of hesychasm remained alive, particularly on Mount Athos. Here, during the second half of the 18th century, there arose an important movement of spiritual renewal whose effects can still be felt today. Its members, known as the Kolivades, were alarmed at the way in which all too many of their fellow Greeks were falling under the influence of the Western Enlightenment. The Kolivades, or Kolivades, were convinced that a regeneration of the Greek nation would come, not through embracing the secular ideas fashionable in the West, but only through a return to the true roots of Orthodox Christianity, through a rediscovery of patristic theology and Orthodox liturgical life. In particular, they advocated frequent communion, if possible, daily, although at this time most Orthodox communicated only 3 or 4 times a year. For this, the Kolivades, or Kolivades, were fiercely attacked on the Holy Mountain and elsewhere, but a council held at Constantinople in 1819 endorsed their standpoint and affirmed that in principle the faithful, if properly prepared, may receive the sacrament at every celebration of the Eucharist. One of the most notable fruits of this spiritual renewal was the appearance of the Philokalia, a vast anthology of ascetic and mystical texts dating from the 4th to the 15th century. Published in Venice in 1782, this is a weighty tome of some 1,207 folio pages. The editors, both leading members of the Kolivades movement, were Saint Macarius, Notarus, Metropolitan of Corinth, 1731 to 1805, and Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, the Hagiorite, 1748 to 1809, who was justly termed an encyclopedia of the Athonite learning of his time. The Philokalia, which was intended by its editors for lay people living in the world as well as for monks, is devoted especially to the theory and practice of inner prayer, and in particular the Jesus prayer. Initially, its impact in the Greek world was limited, and more than a century passed before it was reissued. But the Slavonic translation, published in Moscow in 1793, contributed decisively to the renaissance of Russian spirituality in the 19th century, while more recently, from the 1950s onwards, much more attention has been given to the Philokalia by the Greeks. Translations have also begun to appear in Western languages, and these have appeared to a surprisingly wide public. Indeed, the Philokalia has acted as a spiritual time bomb, for the true age of Philokalia has been not the late 18th century, but the late 20th century. I must get that book and read that. Nicodemus helped in the editing of numerous other texts, most notably the writings of Simeon, the new theologian, and he prepared an edition of Gregory Palamas, although this was never published. Somewhat surprisingly, in view of the strong anti-Catholic feeling in the Greek world at this time, he also drew on Roman Catholic devotional literature, adopting for a Greek Orthodox readership works by Lorenzo Scupulo and by Ignatius Loyola, the founder of Jesuits. Another monk of Mount Athos in the 18th century, Saint Cosmas, the Aetolian, 1714 to 1779, contributed to the revival of the Greek people not through books but through missionary preaching. His ministry resembles that of John Wesley. At a time when the religious and cultural life of the Greeks under Turkish rule had sunk in many places to a very low ebb, he undertook a series of apostolic journeys throughout mainland Greece and the islands, addressing huge crowds. He saw the Greek Orthodox faith and the Greek language as integrally linked, and wherever he went he founded Greek schools. Eventually he was executed by the Ottoman authorities. He is one of the many new martyrs who suffered for their faith in the Turkish period. Glory be to God. It has been rightly said that if there is much to piety in the state of orthodoxy during the Turkish period, there is also much to admire. Despite innumerable discouragements, the Orthodox Church, under Ottoman rule, never lost heart. There were, of course, many cases of apostasy to Islam, but in Europe, at any rate, they were not as frequent as might have been expected. The corruption in the higher administration of the church, depressing though it was, had very little effect on the daily life of the ordinary Christian, who was still able to worship Sunday by Sunday in his parish church. More than anything else, it was the Holy Liturgy which kept orthodoxy alive in those dark days. Amen.